You quote the Buddha in The Spontaneous Healing of Belief as saying, every human being is the author of his own health and disease. Can you explain what that means?
It's commonly said in Western traditions that we begin dying the moment we're born. And that belief is so firmly entrenched into the medical model, as it has been historically, and the way we think about disease and healing on the one hand. And on the other hand, our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions have always told us something very, very different. They say that from the moment we're born, we begin healing. And what the best science of our time now, the early 21st century, is telling us is very, very different from what the scientists of the 20th century have come to believe about the human body and the way that we work, the way we function, and our ability to heal. What we now know is that every organ in the human body has the ability to heal itself, given the right environment. Even the organs we were told could not. So spinal cord tissue, brain tissue, heart tissue, pancreatic tissue, prostate tissue, all of these organs that we are so accustomed to hearing that are failing us from so many different perspectives. The best science of our time is now showing that they are actually designed to repair and heal themselves under the right conditions, given the right environment. What are those conditions? That's the question. Some of them are environmental, that can be exterior to the body, things like water, air, just the quality of our food. Some of them may be chemical, the supplements that we take and some of the herbal products that our ancestors understood and used with great success in healing their bodies before modern medicine ever came along. And I think those are interesting. But really fascinates me is the inner environment. And this is the environment that the Buddha talked to us about so eloquently. And the Buddha said that every man and woman is the architect of their own healing and their own destiny. To the people of his time, I'm not sure how much sense that would have made. But in our world today, it makes tremendous sense because the best science of the 21st century is now bearing out the deepest principles, spiritual principles, of our most ancient and cherished beliefs, telling us that, in fact, we are deeply connected to our bodies, we're deeply connected to the world, and that connection and interconnection is so profound that we have the ability to self-regulate from within to create the effects in our bodies and beyond our bodies. One of the great ironies of our time is that after 5,000 years of recorded human history, with the greatest technological advances in the history of humankind, we still have yet to answer the single most fundamental question that we could ever ask of ourselves. And the question is simply, who are we? Who are we? When science has answered this question for the last 300 years, they've told us a story that is based upon separation. The science of 300 years has told us that we're separate from our bodies, we're separate from one another, we're separate from the earth, we're separate from the cosmos, and that nature, the fundamental rule of nature, is actually based upon a model of competition and conflict. And it is this idea of separation and the idea of conflict that are so deeply ingrained into our lives, into our world, our society, the economies of the world, the corporations of the world, the medical model. They are all based upon these 300-year-old ideas of separation, competition, and conflict. So people often ask me, when I share this information, they say, okay, Greg, we understand maybe science didn't get it quite right over the last 300 years. This is the 21st century. We've got the internet, we've got iPads and cell phones. What difference does it make? And that's a really good question, and the answer surprises a lot of people. Because the world that we know today is a reflection of the way we answer the question, who am I? Who are we? And when we answer that question based in separation, competition, and conflict, those answers are reflected in everything about our world and our lives. So from global economies that are based upon competition and conflict, corporations, and as we mentioned, the modern medical model, to our most intimate relationships. These ideas are so deeply ingrained within us that we literally program our bodies, sometimes unconsciously, to reflect these ideas of separation, competition, and conflict, and it comes up chemically in our bodies. The new science now has overturned 300 years of scientific thinking. New discoveries, and these are based in peer-reviewed science. So this isn't speculation or theory or hypothesis. This is peer-reviewed science, is now telling us, beyond any reasonable doubt, that we are deeply connected to our bodies. We're deeply connected to the earth. We're deeply connected to one another. And that the fundamental model of nature is based in cooperation, what biologists call mutual aid, not the competition and the conflict that we've heard in the past. And this changes everything. It changes everything because we live in a time of extremes in our world, and those extremes in the world are creating extremes within our lives. Perhaps more so now than at any time in our history, we've got to think and live differently than we ever have. And the new science that is confirming our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions is giving us the reasons to change our thinking. And it's telling us what works and what doesn't. And the things that don't work, we don't need to do them any longer. And the things that do work, we can do a lot of them. And this comes right down to the core principles of us, our bodies, our relationship to our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs, and how they play out in our daily lives.
Back to connection and separation. You mentioned what works and what doesn't work.
So when science answers the question, who are we? They say that to do so well, we must first answer 6 separate questions, 6 sub-questions under the umbrella of who are we. So if we can envision an inverted pyramid, so the apex is on the bottom, and in the center of the pyramid, those 6 questions, and then to the left side, the old answers, and to the right side, the new answers. This will be a really good visual for us to understand why we've been led to believe the things we've been led to believe and how the new discoveries help us change those beliefs. We begin at the bottom of the pyramid. The most fundamental question when we ask the question, who are we, is where do we come from? What is our origin? That's the first question. The second question is what are human origins, because they may be separate from the origins of other forms of life. The third question is about relationships. What is our relationship to our body? The next question is what is our relationship to the world beyond our body? The next question is what is our relationship to the past? Is it linear or is it cyclic? And the very last question is what is our relationship to nature? So science says if we can answer these 6 questions, then we have the opportunity to answer the big question, who are we? Who am I? And what's so interesting about this is that for the last 300 years, we say that science began about 300 years ago when Isaac Newton formalized the laws of physics. So for about 300 years, science has attempted to answer these 6 fundamental questions, and their answers have led us to a story of separation. They've told us that the origin of life, it's random, that the origin of human life is random, that we are separate from our bodies and essentially powerless when it comes to healing our bodies or to even regulating the way our bodies function in the world. They've told us that we are separate from the world beyond our bodies. Not only do we have very little influence over what happens within, but we have no influence over what happens in the world beyond our bodies. They've told us that our relationship to the past is linear, and this is important because the belief is that civilization has happened one time. It began about 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, in that area, in Egypt and China, and that it has developed in a linear fashion to the point where we are today, the pinnacle of sophistication that we are today, and that it has happened only once. The last question, beginning in 1859, Charles Darwin began telling us that the fundamental rule of nature is based upon struggle and survival of the strongest, are the words that he used, that nature is based upon a model of competition and conflict. So these ideas of separation from ourselves, from the world, of competition and conflict, they are so deeply ingrained into our lives and our world today that we almost take them for granted. Sometimes we don't even recognize how deeply these ideas are rooted into our lives today. They are rooted in the nature of the economies of the world that are actually buckling and collapsing under the weight of their unsustainability right now. They are deeply rooted in the ideas of corporations, in the way that people work together, in the way that we share resources, in the way that we heal our body. All of these ideas, the medical model, for example, is deeply based in these ideas of separation. The best science of the late 20th and now the early 21st century has overturned 300 years of scientific thinking with new discoveries that are peer-reviewed in the scientific literature on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a reluctance and often a flat-out resistance to share this in the mainstream. So the new discoveries that overturn 300 years of science are not commonly seen in the classrooms, in the textbooks, in the documentaries, in the mainstream media for a number of reasons. And people ask me, what would those reasons be? And it's an easy answer. It's ego, habit, money, primarily, the habit of teaching, the old traditions, and the textbooks that reflect those. And the educators, 30, 40, 50 years of their lives have told the same story. There's understandably a reluctance to embrace those new ideas. So what are the new ideas? The best science now of the 20th, late 20th, and early 21st century is telling us that the origin of life is certainly not random. Physical evidence is telling us that. The science is telling us that the origin of human life, the DNA, is telling us that we are not random. And we can talk more about what that means. But we are not simply the product of an evolutionary fluke of biology that happened 200,000 years ago. The best science of our day is now telling us that we are deeply connected to our bodies. And this is important. They're telling us that our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs, originating both in the brain and in the heart, trigger the chemistry that can actually reverse disease, heal our bodies, trigger longevity in ways that have not commonly been accepted in the West. And this is what the best science now is telling us. That science is telling us that we're deeply connected to the world beyond our bodies. Quantum physics is now telling us, beyond any doubt, about this connection. There no longer is a controversy as to whether or not we are connected with one another in the world. The controversy is to what degree are we connected? How deep does our connection go? How deeply may we influence? And I'm going to use that word very, very intentionally. It's not about control, manipulation. But how deeply can we influence our bodies or the bodies of our loved ones when it comes to healing, or the world beyond our bodies? How much influence do we really have? The science now is telling us, when it comes to this linear idea of civilization, is that civilization is actually cyclic, and we happen to be the most recent 5,000-year cycle. When we say history began 5,000 years ago, that's the beginning of our cycle. But there was a cycle before that, 5,000 years, and another one before that, pushing the date of advanced technological civilizations back into the last ice age. And the reason this is important, we have to ask ourselves, if we humans have been here that long and have gone through at least 3 cycles of advanced technological civilization, what did they know that we've forgotten?
You were talking about the cycles and the advanced civilizations before and what that tells us.
So the best science of our time is now telling us that when it comes to civilization, is much, much older than we've been led to believe. We now know that our 5,000 years of recorded human history is a cycle, and it is only the most recent of at least 3 cycles that are now dating advanced technological civilizations back into the last ice age. What we have to ask ourselves when we consider this is that if we humans have been here this long, and we have been through 3 cycles of civilization, this being the 3rd, what is it that we may have known in the past that we've forgotten today? Or what is it that our ancestors knew that maybe we've never even discovered? What can we learn from them? And that's the value. And the last piece on our pyramid, on our inverted pyramid, is that science now is telling us that nature, the fundamental rule of nature, is actually based upon cooperation and what biologists call mutual aid, not the competition and the conflict that Darwin proposed 150 years ago. This changes everything. And people ask me often, they say, okay, Greg, maybe science didn't get it right. Here we are, the early 21st century, we've got iPads and internet and cell phone and Facebook. So what? What difference does it make? And it's a really good question. And the answer surprises a lot of people. Our society, the roots of our society, the foundation was being created in the late 1800s and early 1900s, precisely when ideas of Darwin's, for example, were being embraced. Competition, conflict, separation. And those ideas were so widely accepted, they are so deeply ingrained into our lives in ways that sometimes maybe we don't even recognize. They show up again and again as the unsustainable principles of the way we think and the way we live. For example, the global economy is buckling and collapsing in some places. And the question is why? Why isn't this system working? It's based upon an idea of competition and conflict, which is an unsustainable idea. The fundamental rule of nature is cooperation. So people say, well, we see competition and conflict in nature all the time. And I say, yes, we do. We have to be honest with ourselves. It is there. However, it is in response to specific conditions. It is not the fundamental rule of nature. And the more competition and the more conflict that we see in the world, that tells us how far we have strayed from our truest relationship, the truest nature of our relationship with nature. So when we consider these new discoveries, it changes the way we answer the question, who am I? Who are we? We go from the idea of separation and competition to connection and cooperation. That is reflected in the world around our bodies as nature. It is reflected within our bodies. And I'm sharing this because this principle is the principle of healing that is often overlooked in the modern medical model. The modern medicine is based upon the old ideas of separation and competition and conflict on a biological level, on a cellular level in our bodies. So now we have a new way of answering the question, who am I? Who are we? We are not what we've been told in the past. We are more probably than we've ever imagined in our lives. And this then becomes the template from which we can look at any question when it comes to us and our relationship to our bodies for the answers that are based on science that reflect our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions. So I think we all know that there is an epidemic of disease running rampant in our world today in a way that we have never seen before. Some of that is because we are a globalized civilization. That's true. And some of the environmental toxins that used to be localized are now more globalized. However, on a deeper level, I can tell you personally, from the journeys that I've taken into some of the most magnificent, beautiful, pristine, remote, and isolated places remaining in the world today, that the conditions and the diseases that we often take for granted here in the Western world, in the modern world, either because of age or simply because of environment, they simply do not exist in some of these other cultures. I've been with people in the southern Andes where the cancers simply don't exist. They don't get breast cancer and prostate cancer. In Asia, in Egypt, in the Middle East, people well into their 100s who have memories just as sharp as attack. And we're often told that dementias and the loss of memory is a function of age. It's less a function of an age, from my experience, and more about how we live as we attain that age. What are the factors that contribute to these conditions that are stealing from us the very thing that we cherish the most, and that's life itself, both ours and our loved ones? And the answer is sometimes difficult for people to see. But it is in the way that we have chosen to live our lives and the way we've chosen to think and believe about ourselves as we're living our lives. And these are two separate yet related ways of looking at what's happening to us in our bodies. When I was in school, I was taught that the brain is the master organ in the body. And the brain is certainly important, and we all acknowledge that. But what the new science is showing us is that the brain receives many of the instructions that tell it what to do, that tell it what chemistry to release into the body, what hormones to trigger within our bodies. It's true, those signals come from the brain, and the brain receives the instructions telling it what to do from our heart, the human heart. And it probably shouldn't be so surprising that the heart plays such a powerful role in our lives because it's the first organ that develops in our bodies when our mother's womb. Before any other organ develops, the heart develops first. And one of the great mysteries in the Western medical model is what is it that triggers that very first heartbeat? What is it that happens in one instant where there is a mass of cells and tissue that are motionless, and the next instant something happens, the spark that triggers the life that begins beating is our heartbeat. What happens? Science has yet to answer that question. They don't know for sure. This is one of the places where our ancestors had an answer that science simply cannot support at this time. And what our ancestors said to us is that that first heartbeat, it's the moment that the soul comes into the body, the moment that we make the connection with something greater, something bigger than ourselves. And whether we believe that scientifically or not, the fact is that something happens with that first heartbeat, and we become enabled and capacitated as a human being in ways that no other creatures that we know of have the ability to express. That's what gives us our power to heal. As I mentioned, it's often said that we begin dying the moment we're born. And what the science is showing us very clearly is that we now begin healing the moment we're born. And the reason I can say that is because we now know beyond any doubt every organ in the human body is wired to heal. Every organ in the human body has the capacity to not only heal damage, but to regenerate the damage and the tissue after it has been damaged. We can regenerate and heal even the organs we were told were not capable of doing so, such as the brain, the heart, the pancreas, spinal cord tissue. All of these have been scientifically documented with the ability to repair and heal themselves given the right conditions, under the right conditions, the right environment. So our role now, when we talk about healing, and the essence of healing, is what is the environment that optimizes our ability to honor the gift of life in our bodies? Where does that really come from? And we can look at that from a number of different levels. Certainly the physical environment, fresh air, sunshine, clean water, is a very powerful part of that. And our ancestors, thousands of years ago, knew that fresh air and clean water was medicine. If someone was ill, they would take them out and they would say, breathe this air, drink this water, and miraculously they would begin to heal, and now we know why. But it goes beyond that. It's the inner environment, thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs we know can be either healing or toxic. And this is a relatively new way for science to think about us and our relationship to our bodies. But what we now know is that the quality of emotions that we create within our heart determine the signal that we send to the brain to release the chemistry into our bodies. Every moment of every day, there's a conversation that is happening between our heart and our brain. It's a two-way conversation. Our heart is having a big conversation with the brain, and the brain does communicate back to the heart, but not quite so much. It's a smaller series of signals that seem to go back to the heart. There is this two-way conversation. And we regulate the quality of that conversation through the emotions that we harbor within our hearts. So for example, when we feel that we're not safe in the world, when we feel fear, hate, anger, jealousy, rage, anxiety, those kinds of feelings, they send a specific signal to the brain, and based on that signal, the brain will release the chemistry in the body that mirrors that signal. So in the case of anger, hate, jealousy, rage, frustration, that is stress. And the stress chemistry in our body, as we all know, high levels of cortisol and adrenaline, which are really good for brief periods of time, what we call fight or flight. And we have to make a decision and either run like crazy or stand and take a stand. We're designed to do that. What we're not designed to do is live our lives under sustained conditions of fight or flight. A few minutes, but you don't want to live that way every day and every hour and every week and every month. And I know people that do. And they look like they do. They wear their hurt and they wear that stress in their bodies. Their immune systems are weakened in the presence of that kind of stress. Anti-aging hormones are suppressed because all the energy of the body is going into fight or flight. So I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that those experiences are bad to have when they are unresolved stress. That is where it becomes a problem in our lives. The stress in and of itself is simply a signal. It's saying to us, it's giving us a heads up, saying something in the environment needs our attention. And if we can honor that signal and say, what is it about my environment that I need to address? What do I need to look at? What do I need to change? And then make our choices from that point forward. I think that's a healthy way to embrace the stress. It's when we anesthetize the stress with drugs, alcohol, addictions, chemical addictions, or digital addictions, which is a new issue now that scientists are having to talk about now. They all have the same effect. So it's the kind of environment that we create within our bodies is directly mirrored through the health and the well-being of our bodies. One of the new discoveries that just fascinates me it was actually made in 1991. It was not published until 1994. And is the discovery of about 40,000 specialized cells in the human heart that are concentrated in a very precise way, a neural network within the heart. They are cells that are called sensory neurites. They're brain-like cells, but they're not in the brain. And they function in the heart very similar to the way brain cells would function in the brain. These cells, they think, they learn, they remember independently of the cranial brain, or we may tune our heart and our brain together, harmonize our heart and our brain so that these two separate organs actually share a common neural network, and we have the opportunity to embrace the power of that network in our lives. And this is where we have the extraordinary experiences of deep levels of intuition, precognition, and the health effects, such as the triggering of anti-aging hormones in our bodies, and the triggering of tremendously powerful immune response in our bodies. It all comes from our ability to regulate this connection between our heart and our brain. And this is one of the places where our ancestors were very clear in their traditions, and science only now is catching up with that wisdom. So one of the questions that people ask is how something like a thought or an emotion can possibly have the power to change the chemistry in our bodies. And it's a really good question, because in the modern world, in the Western world, we have been conditioned largely to believe that thoughts, feelings, and emotions are really no things. We've been taught to discount them in our culture on the one hand, and on the other hand, in many of the indigenous cultures, they are the most important things in their lives, the most potent agents of healing that someone can have. So the question, how does this work? And we're looking at a couple of different levels. What we know now, I say we in modern science, is that when we have an emotion within our hearts, that emotion sends a signal to our brain, and the quality of that signal determines what the brain does in response to the emotion. So if you can imagine a signal from the heart to the brain that is a very smooth series of waves, nice, even, coherent is the term that's used, waves from the heart to the brain will match that smooth, even, organized chemistry, and it will release the chemistry that supports life into our bodies. This is where our immune systems become really strong, super immune response. Even anti-aging hormones are triggered in the presence of this kind of a signal from the heart to the brain. On the other hand, the stress chemistry, when we feel those moments of frustration, anger, hate, jealousy, rage, fear, the signal looks different. It looks kind of like a bad day on the stock market. It's a lot of very chaotic, unorganized, jagged waves going from the heart to the brain, and the brain receives those waves and says, oh, I need to match this chemistry. This is stress chemistry. So this is where the adrenaline and the cortisol and the stress hormones are released into the body, which, as we said, is good for short periods of time. You just don't want to live your life in that way with those chemicals racing through your bloodstream. So our ability, all of a sudden now we realize this, our ability to regulate that signal, what could be more important? Our ability to regulate the signal between our heart and our brain becomes front and center of the health and the healing of our lives. This is a completely different way of thinking about our inner environment from what the medical model is showing today. Medical model based on the pyramid of our relationship to ourselves and our bodies, the answer to the question, who are we? That medical model suggests that we're separate from our bodies. So there's no reason to expect that anything that we could do from within would have any beneficial effect in our bodies. I remember the first time I discovered this on my own. I was a competitive runner for about 20 years when I lived in Denver, Colorado, working with the corporations. I never had the opportunity to do these things when I was in high school, so I had the opportunity in the corporations to run triathlon teams and competitive marathons. And the first time I injured my leg running, and I went to a doctor, I remember I was sitting on the edge of the examination table, and the doctor was at a stool in front of me, and he was looking at my knee, and I asked him the question. And I said, what is it that I can do? What can I visualize? What can I feel that will help my knee to heal any faster? I remember the doctor, he looked up at me, and he said, son, he said, you can visualize and feel anything you want to heal. He says, it's not going to make a bit of difference. He said, your leg will heal when it's ready to heal. And immediately in my mind, I thought, well, this man has a very different view of healing than what I've come to understand. But it's not surprising when we look at the way science has answered the question, who are we? This is why it's so important. Our lives reflect this idea of separation and the powerlessness that comes from separation. And when we live our lives in that way, it's very, very different from living knowing that we are designed, that we are wired to heal and regenerate our bodies. We approach life a completely different way when we embrace the deepest truths of our existence. So we look at the chemistry that is triggered from the heart and the brain. This is one way that we begin to initiate this healing process in our bodies. And it goes even deeper because we're talking about the 40,000 plus nerve cells in the heart, the sensory neurites that are essentially brain-like cells, except they're in the heart. Each of those cells, when it is stimulated in the proper way, the cell itself begins to create the neurites, and the neurite is any appendage that extends from the cell itself. Why is this important? Because it is the neurites that make the connections with the other neurites that create the synapses across which the signal from our heart to our brain is transmitted. So the more of these connections that we create, the stronger the signal and the more reflexive the signal will be in our lives. When we learn to do the techniques, it becomes almost second nature. We don't have to sit down in just the right time of day and close the door and light a candle and turn on the music and burn the incense and create just the right environment to trigger this healing in our bodies. Once we begin to embrace the techniques of harmonizing our heart and our brain, you can do it anywhere. And the truth is, when we need it the most, those are often the least opportune times in our lives of when we can make these connections. So here's the way it works. It is the very act, the act of us feeling the feelings of already being healed, for example. Even when our body is showing us an illness or a disease, when we can feel the feeling of what it's like to be absent of that disease, we can feel what it feels like to be whole and healthy and intact and fully enabled, fully embodied as a being. That is the signal that triggers these nerves to begin to grow and reach out for other nerves that are mirroring those signals. It is the act, the expectation of us in that healed state that triggers our body to reflect what it is that we are expecting of it. And it doesn't happen instantaneously. It takes about 72 hours. You can see the time-lapse photographs of 72 hours for one neurite to be able to connect to another one. It takes about 72 hours under the time-lapse for these to grow. So this opens up a whole new door of possibilities. The number 72 is very significant in ancient traditions and ancient texts when it comes to healing. 3 days, 72 hours. Many traditions, including Christian tradition, tell us this is about how long it takes for the typical body to heal, and now we know why. Because that is the length of time it's taking for these neural connections to be established. So the more that we can feel the feeling as if our healing has already occurred, giving thanks for that healing already being present, that is the trigger for our bodies to grow the nerve cells, to make the connections, to trigger the brain chemistry to reflect that healing.
Whether it's the flu, whether it's late-stage cancer, how do you feel the feeling of already being healed and feeling grateful? But how does one do that when they're in pain and feeling nauseous? Because I get everything conceptually and intellectually. It's
Sure.
just the actual doing of it
Sure.
is hard.
So in 1859, Charles Darwin published his paradigm-shattering book entitled On the Origin of Species. And with that book, the scientific community of that time, a little over 150 years ago, embraced the ideas that he presented almost without question. And what Darwin was trying to do during his time, he was trying to answer the question, who are we? And he was trying to do it without the need for God, religion, or faith, or the church, which had always been the way these questions were answered in the past. So when people, prior to Darwin's time, when they asked, how do we heal? How do we live our lives in a better way? Where do we come from? How do things work? Those questions were all answered by the church traditionally. Darwin, as a scientist, said, I'm going to make the first step in leading the modern world to an answer that does not require God, faith, the church, or religion. And the origin of species was his way of doing that. So I have to say personally, my personal feeling, I think Darwin, he was obviously a scientist. I think he was a good scientist. And Darwin had no way of knowing in his time what we know today. He couldn't have known about cells and neurites and DNA that we only have discovered recently. So not to criticize Darwin's ideas, but to help us to understand why we think and why we've been led to believe what we have about our bodies and where the new discoveries are changing all of that. What Darwin said was that life began as a single organism, and he didn't know how that organism appeared. He didn't try to explain that. He said life began as a single organism, and over a long period of time, that organism became many organisms, and the diversity that we see of those organisms, the different arms and legs and appendages and different ways of seeing and standing upright or not, those were all a response of the organism to a need that it perceived in the environment. And this is actually a fundamental principle in the theory of evolution. It says that nature will never over-endow us. It means we will only be given the things in our bodies that we need when there's demand for them in the world around us. The reason I'm mentioning this is because it's a problem when it comes to humans. I'm a geologist. I'm a trained geologist. And as a geologist, I can say that evolution is a fact in the fossil record. I can also say it breaks down when it comes to us humans. And here's the reason why. And it ties directly into why we have the ability to heal the way we do. Humans appeared on the earth about 200,000 years ago, and we don't know where we came from. There is no clear record in the evolutionary family tree, no clear fossil record leading to us. All those little lines that we see on the evolutionary tree, if you look closely, they are inferred or speculative relationships, yet they are being taught as fact, even though we do not have the evidence to support them. We appeared 200,000 years ago. Suddenly, we had a brain 50% larger than our nearest primate relative. We had an advanced nervous system that allows us the abilities of healing, self-regulated healing that we're talking about now, that set us apart from any other forms of life. And here's the key. We have not changed in those 200,000 years. If you take the body of what are called anatomically modern humans, AMH, they used to be called Cro-Magnon, now they're called AMH, because the name is self-descriptive. Anatomically modern humans. We are them a few thousand centuries later. If you compare them to us, our brain size is the same, our body proportions are the same, and the capabilities haven't changed. What this says for evolution is that the advanced brain and nervous system that gives us the ability to heal, it didn't evolve over a long period of time in response to the world. It appears to be inherent in our being. It was with us from the moment we arrived, and because science is telling us we haven't changed, what we can say is we have today the wiring, the equipment that we arrived with 200,000 years ago. So I can say to you that we are wired for healing. We are literally designed. We don't know how or who or why scientifically, I can't confirm that. But what I can say is that Darwin's ideas of evolution break down when it comes to us, and our ability to heal our bodies is a perfect example of where that breakdown occurs as we know it today. So we have this advanced nervous system that we regulate through the choices we make in our lives, of what we think, what we feel, what we believe, and specifically the emotions that we choose to respond to what life brings to our doorstep. So when we learn to respond to hurt in new and healthy and empowering ways, we literally are changing the chemistry of hurt in our bodies. And when we learn to embrace what we have seen as failures in the past, when we realize they're not really failures, there's something we tried that simply didn't work, and now we're going to try it again. That's a very, very different feeling than the idea of failure and comparing that to success. These all translate into the chemistry in our bodies. So when we can affirm in our bodies by giving thanks of gratitude and appreciation for the healing that's already occurring in our bodies, this is the basis for many of the prayers and the meditations that I have personally seen with indigenous people from all over the world. Even when it looks like there's nothing wrong with them, they still give thanks for their healing because they are acknowledging that it is an ongoing process. We are healing every moment of every day. So one of the questions people often ask is how could something that happens inside of our bodies possibly have any influence, any effect over what happens beyond our bodies, beyond the boundary of our skin and our flesh? How could it possibly influence the world around us? I think maybe the best way to help explain that from my understanding is through a story. I live in the high desert of northern New Mexico, about an hour from the nearest town and about a mile from the nearest neighbor. So it's a very isolated, remote, pristine, magnificently beautiful part of the world. And in the early 1990s, the high desert of northern New Mexico was in a severe drought, the worst in over 100 years that the elders remembered. Cattle were suffering, crops were dying, and it was really bad. And a native friend of mine, and I'll call him David to honor his privacy. I call him David so much that when I see him now, I actually think of him as David. Called me one day. David called me and he said, "Gregg, would you like to join me in a place that our ancestors built so long ago we don't even know who built this medicine wheel where it is today? Would you like to join me in that place for a prayer of rain?" And I didn't have to think twice. I said, "Sure, absolutely, I'd love to." And I wasn't prepared for what David showed me that day, because I had an expectation that I would see some chanting, some dancing, some kind of movement, some kind of a ceremony, and that's not what I saw at all. We hiked across 130,000 acres, the most fragrant high desert sage. It's the kind that releases its scent when your knees brush up against the little leaves. It's just beautiful. And we arrived at this ancient medicine wheel. And David sat down, he unlaced the shoes, his old work boots, and with his naked feet, he stepped into the center of this wheel. And he turned his back to me, and he closed his eyes, and he held his hands in a prayer mudra just for a few seconds in silence. And then he turned and looked at me and he said, I'm hungry. You want to go get a bite to eat? And I was shocked. I said, yeah, at some point, I said, but I thought you were going to pray for rain. And this is the key. This is why I'm sharing this story. He looked from inside that circle right into my eyes. He said, no. He said, if I prayed for rain, rain could never happen. Because the moment we ask for something to happen, we have just acknowledged to the universe that it does not exist. Now, we've just affirmed that it doesn't exist. We've affirmed the very thing that we're praying to change. And I said, well, if you didn't pray for rain, what did you do? He said, when I closed my eyes, he said, I felt the feeling of what it feels like when it rains in our Pueblo village. He said, I smelled the smells of what it smells like when the rain rolls off the earthen walls of my Pueblo home. And I felt the feeling of my naked feet in the mud, and the mud is there because there's been so much rain. And I gave thanks of gratitude and appreciation for the rain that has already happened. We went into the nearest town, to Taos, New Mexico, and we had lunch. And by the time I got back up onto my property that afternoon, I saw something that we hadn't seen for a long time. Big black clouds came in over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and by nightfall, it started to rain. And it rained and rained and rained. It rained all night. It rained all the next morning, the next afternoon. It rained and rained, and it didn't stop. It rained so much. The fields were flooded, the roads were flooded, cattle were stranded, and I called my friend David on the phone. And I said, David, what in the world is this? I said, this is a mess. I said, everything is just covered with rain. I said, it's flooding everywhere. And he was silent just for a moment. And he said, Gregg, that's the part of the prayer the ancestors could never figure out. He said they could bring the rain, they couldn't tell it how much rain to bring. So when I tell that story, I have to say that scientifically, I cannot say as a scientist that David's prayer created the rain. What I can say is there's a high correlation between the time that prayer was offered and when the clouds came in that had not been there for months in that localized geographic area. I watched the weather reports from the TV stations that we're able to bring in nearby communities. And I saw the weatherman from Denver, Colorado, as he was looking at the jet stream. And the jet stream was coming across the west, and as it got to Wyoming, it dipped down into Colorado and down into New Mexico and made a little turn and came right back up, right over the place where the rain had happened. And the weatherman stepped back and he simply said, because he hadn't seen anything like this. So how does that happen? How is it possible that one man's heartfelt gratitude could possibly have an influence on our physical environment? Or is it possible? Well, it is. And I'd like to share with you the reason why. In the late 1800s, there was a tremendous spiritual revolution that was sweeping the earth. Science and spirituality were actually very close, and they were coming together in a shared vision of our connected nature and how the world works. And all that changed with World War I. We went into a wartime mentality, and we were just coming out from that, and World War II came along, and then other wars after that. And the question that we have to ask right now is, we are undergoing a similar spiritual and scientific revolution. The wars of the past wiped out the possibility of this merging between science and spirituality. Are we going to do the same thing again? But what happened in the late 1800s is that there was a very famous experiment that was conducted in 1887. It was at Case Western Reserve University, in the basement of the university, in a very obscure room. An experiment was conducted that changed the way scientists think about the world forever. It was called the Michelson-Morley experiment, two very famous scientists. And the purpose of the experiment was simply this. The scientific community believed that there was a field of energy that connects all things, yet they had not been able to prove it scientifically. And there was a body of scientists also who said it doesn't exist. And so the experiment was to determine once and for all, definitively, is this field here or is it not? In 1887, the experiment was conducted. And in my opinion, I think it was a good experiment. I think it was poorly interpreted. It looked like this. If I were to go outside and moisten my finger and place it above my head, and the moment that I did that outdoors, if I felt no wind against my finger, and I made the assumption that no air exists, that is the equivalent of the Michelson-Morley experiment. Just because the wind isn't blowing doesn't mean the air doesn't exist. They believed if the field is out there, it's in motion. They should be able to detect the motion. The experiment failed to detect the motion, and they concluded that there is no field that connects all things. And the best science of the 20th century is based upon this idea of separation, that there is no field that connects everything else. So what we do here has no effect on what happens here. What I ask for or pray for my loved ones and my relatives in my body has no effect upon them halfway around the world until 1987. 100 years later, all of this changed. 100 years later, the Michelson-Morley experiment was repeated with better equipment under the auspices of the United States Air Force. And lo and behold, with better equipment, 100 years later, not only did they detect the field that Michelson and Morley had predicted, but it was exactly in the range, under the parameters that they had expected 100 years earlier. Their equipment simply hadn't been able to detect the field. So we now know that a field exists that connects all things. It's causing problems in the scientific community because the mathematics are based upon the absence of this field. So this is where quantum physics is coming in with traditional physics, and they're changing the story when we say, who are we? We now know we are deeply connected with ourselves, with one another, to the earth, to the cosmos, and we know the reason why. So when we ask the question, how could my prayer, how could my meditation, how could my loving thoughts of gratitude and appreciation possibly impact the healing of another person in the room with me or halfway around the world? Now we have an answer. And the answer is that we are deeply connected through a phenomenon that is known as entanglement. Entanglement is the term in physics that tells us how deeply connected we really are. Nicholas Gisin was the scientist in Geneva, Switzerland, that determined this in the 90s. What he did was he took a particle of matter, a photon, this is what atoms are made of, and he divided that photon. He split it into two because he wanted two equal photons. So they were twins. And using fiber optic cables, they shot these two photons in opposite directions from one another, 7 miles in one direction, 7 miles in the other direction, till they were 14 miles apart, and they began a series of experiments. What the experiment showed is that what happened to one photon when it was tickled, is the term they used, when it was made to rotate clockwise, for example, or to take a certain path. Whatever happened here, the one 14 miles away acted like it was having exactly the same experience, even though it was no longer physically connected. And the question the scientists had to ask was, how is that possible? Why are they acting like they are connected? And the answer is the phenomenon known as entanglement that says once something is unified, once something begins as a whole, even though it is separated physically by many miles or light years, is what they're finding in the cosmos, energetically everything's still connected. Why is that important? Because if we go back far enough in time, there was a point in time when you and me and the earth were all connected before what is called the Big Bang, the big release of energy. And when that happened, we were deeply connected. When that happened, physically, particles began to separate. Energetically, the particles remain connected. We are part of this earth, and we are part of one another. You are part of this earth, and you are part of all that you see. And that empowers you, and it empowers me to participate in the healing of our bodies and those of our loved ones in ways that science is only beginning to understand. So the prayer of my friend David is an example in indigenous wisdom of a principle that science has only recently begun to bear out under laboratory conditions. So I'm fascinated that our ancestors, they didn't necessarily know the science, but they knew the techniques. They knew what works and what doesn't. They knew and understood their relationship to the world. And this fascinates me. As we mentioned, science is about 300 years old. And for 300 years, science has tried to prove whether or not we have this connection between ourselves and the earth, whereas our ancestors, for 5,000 years, they began with the assumption that everything is connected rather than trying to prove it. And for 5,000 years, they've asked the question, how can we use that connection to make our lives better and to help our friends and our family and create a stronger community? So this is where the blending of science and spirituality, I think, is so key. Science can only tell us the nuts and bolts of how something works. Science cannot necessarily tell us how to apply that in our lives. Human experience can tell us how to apply that in our lives without knowing specifically why things work the way they work. So we find ourselves today in this time of extremes in our lives and in the world. My sense is that as we embrace the marriage of science and spirituality, we create a wisdom that in their union is greater than either can be individually. And I think that's what gives us the evolutionary edge in our time of extremes. So when I talk about my friend David and his prayer, it is such a powerful example of this principle that was understood by our ancestors. And again, science is only beginning to bear it out under laboratory conditions. What happened when David created that prayer? Why did it have the effect that it has? Well, what our science now knows is that we live in a world of electrical and magnetic fields. That is an accepted fact. Recently, the discoveries have shown that the human heart, your heart and my heart, are the strongest electrical and magnetic fields in the human body, not the brain, as we have been taught in the past. Now, the brain does have an electrical field and a magnetic field, and they are relatively weak when compared to the human heart. So if we are beings designed to communicate with the world around us, and that world is an electrical and magnetic world, it makes perfect sense to me that our communication wouldn't necessarily be a verbal communication, although it may be, but that it would be an energetic communication with the one organ in our body designed to do just that, and that is our heart. So now we know that this relationship between the heart and the brain is key in influencing not only what happens within our bodies, but outside of our bodies. When we are able to harmonize the heart and the brain, and this is what my friend David did in his way, and this is what's being done in the laboratory now, what we do is we access that harmonization that's called coherence, and it can actually be measured electrically. Optimum coherence between the heart and the brain is 0.1 hertz, a very, very low frequency, less than 1, 0.1. And this is a frequency, interestingly, that dolphins and whales communicate with, that military submarines communicate with. That's why it's a problem for the dolphins and the whales, because it is such a universal and powerful frequency. So when we can feel the feelings in our heart, when we can choose to create the feelings in our heart that generate 0.1 hertz between the heart and the brain, now we are harmonized, we are connected. It is called coherence. The Institute of Heart Math, a pioneering research institute in Northern California, was one of the first to confirm this in a practical way that we can use in our everyday lives. They do an amazing job of researching the heart in ways that are not done conventionally and traditionally in universities. The power of the heart, although it's all done under very rigid rules of science. So what the Institute of Heart Math has found is that when we can close our eyes, turn our attention inward, and focus on our heart center, move out of our mind, out of our brain, into our heart. The act of doing that, first of all, that shifts our body. that begins to shift the chemistry, because generally our attention is in the world around us. Now we're saying it's focused within, and that tells your body, something is just shifted, something's going to happen, number one. As we can begin to breathe a little bit slower than usual, maybe 5 to 6 seconds inhale or exhale, and whatever works for you. What we find is that sends a second signal to our body, because the only time we really begin to breathe that way is when we know that we are safe in the world, and that when we are in an environment where it's okay not to be vigilant of the world around us, but to have that inner focus. So we slow our breathing. That sends a second signal to the body. And this is one of the techniques that's used to move our attention from our heart to our brain. Now, my friend David, in his native tradition, he created a mudra. It's called a mudra, where the energy centers of our fingertips and our palm are put together. And with this mudra, he physically touched his heart center in a very Buddhist-like way. And we see this with the monks and the nuns and the abbots in the Buddhist monasteries all the time. And people say, well, what are they doing? One of the things they're doing is connecting the energy centers of their body. Now, they've made contact with all of these body circuits. And as they physically touch their heart center, the act of the touch automatically draws our awareness to the place in our body where we feel the sensation. So they are physically holding that pressure right on their heart center, moving their awareness from their mind and their hearts. And I don't say this as a rule. It's something that Native peoples have found work for them. If it works for them, it may work for you as well in traditional indigenous traditions. So this is why we're doing this. It's not a religious connotation, but it's a very powerful, energetic mudra calling our awareness to our hearts in that moment. So as we move our awareness to our heart, as we slow the breathing, the third step now is to feel the feelings in our heart of gratitude, appreciation, care, compassion, to give thanks for what has already happened. And what the researchers at HeartMath have found is that those words, other words may work for an individual. You know yourself better than anyone else. But it is those words under laboratory conditions that optimize this coherence: appreciation, gratitude, care, compassion. And as we can begin to feel this feeling, that is what sets up the coherence that harmonizes the heart and the brain. Okay, so this is the third step. The first one, move your awareness into your heart. The second one, shift the awareness and slow the breathing. And the third one is to feel the feeling. And as we go through these very simple steps, we are harmonizing the heart and the brain and two separate neural networks into a single potent system. And once we're in this space, now the door is open for a myriad of uses from this very powerful space. This is where we can begin to feel the feelings as if we're already healed, and our cells begin to respond to that. It is also from this place where we can intentionally create deep states of intuition, which also play a powerful role in healing. And we all know about intuition spontaneously. We have moments at a stoplight in the Western world, in a vehicle. You're at a stoplight waiting for a red light to turn green. And during those few seconds, you're maybe thinking about nothing. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you have this tremendous insight. You understand the deepest questions of human existence and the meaning of life and the purpose of our origin. And the light turns green and it all goes away because now we're focused in our lives again. That's a spontaneous experience. How do we create that on demand when we choose? And the technique that I'm sharing with you is a technique that is used to do precisely that. And it's with this deep sense of intuition that we can actually have a conversation with our bodies. We go into this space and ask our bodies to share with us what it is that they need in the moments of disease and illness. We don't ask with our mind, we ask with our heart. And this is where the 40,000 sensory neurites in the heart become so necessary, because they think and remember and feel and communicate separately from our brain. So as we learn to listen literally to the language of our heart, not a verbal language. Our body can actually tell us what it's experiencing, what it needs from us, what it needs to change in the environment, and what we can do to facilitate the healing that we are wired to experience.
Based on our disease, how can we become aware of our subconscious beliefs that aren't serving us?
So the new discoveries of science are now, in many instances, confirming what our ancestors have said to us for a very long time when it comes to us, the healing of our bodies and our relationship to our bodies and the earth, and our ability to influence the healing. What we know is that our body literally is a mirror of what we believe to be true about ourselves and our relationship to the world. The key is many of our beliefs are not necessarily conscious. Some of our most deeply held beliefs are ingrained into us for our birth in utero. Until we were about 7 years old. Our brain state is what is considered a hypnagogic state. We are essentially an open sponge to the world, absorbing the patterns from all of those people that we are exposed to and surrounded with. So if we have caregivers who are really conscious and have learned to manage their emotions and heal their hurts in a healthy way, that's a really good thing. Very few people I know were blessed enough to come from those families. So many of us have experiences both in relationships and in the condition of our bodies as adults, and sometimes young adults. It doesn't have to be, when we're in our 50s, 60s, and 70s. That actually is mirroring subconscious beliefs that have been instilled with us almost from the time of our birth. But we don't know what those are. So how do we go about finding out what they are? And this is a very, very different way of thinking about our bodies. If we can view our bodies literally as a mirror of our experience and of our beliefs without judging it right, wrong, good, or bad. So when we have a condition that shows up that a doctor will call a disease or an illness, if we can embrace the fact that our body is expressing in that moment something as a reflection that we are harboring consciously or subconsciously, if we can embrace that without the judgment and use that, as my dear friend and spiritual brother and colleague, Darren Weissman, calls a portal. He says every illness, every disease, it's a portal into our bodies. The question is, are we willing to step through that portal to look and see what our body is actually telling us? And when our answer to that is yes, then we begin to see that our body is simply reflecting energetically the quality of the belief that we hold. So for example, and I'll use myself as an example, I come from a very dysfunctional family of alcoholic. My father was alcoholic. He left when I was 10 years old. And before he left, the damage that was inflicted upon the three members of my family, my mother, myself, and I have a younger brother, we each interpreted our experiences very uniquely. So one of the hallmarks of the alcoholism was to belittle other people, to criticize tremendously. So there was a lot of criticism in my family, and we each interpreted it differently. For me personally, when I heard it, I never believed it. So, so I early on found a healthy way to deal with that. I have other family members who did believe it, and they embraced that criticism to such a degree that their self-esteem was damaged, and it affected the choices they made of life partners, of jobs, of careers, of their own bodies and their health, all linked to these beliefs that they weren't even aware that they were hearing, when they were very young in life. So this is an example of how these things can show up in our lives. So when we have the wisdom to recognize that our body isn't necessarily broken, that is expressing something to us, and we have the courage and the strength to take the step and say, what is it, body? My body, what are you telling me in this moment? And I know scientists who literally have conversations with their cells. They communicate with their cells. We believe that we are an individual, but we are actually a community of about 50 trillion or so cells, as Bruce Lipton would tell us, my dear brother's spiritual friend and colleague. And those 50 trillion or so cells function as a community that has a name. My community is called Gregg. So I can talk to Gregg. If I'm on the road, if I'm behind the stage getting ready to walk out and I start feeling something in my body, rather than being afraid and taking something to make it go away, I'll say, what is it that you need, Gregg? What is it that you need? My body, I'm literally talking this way to myself. And I'm asking from my heart through the technique that I just shared. And what's so fascinating to me is that the answers will be apparent before the question is even complete. If I'm asking the question, my heart already has the answer. And I know almost immediately what it is that I need in that moment. And often it's something as simple as shifting the perspective of a belief. People ask me all the time, how deeply connected could we possibly be in the world? I mean, how literal is that connection? And I answer the question by sharing a couple of stories. I lived in Northern California in the early 1990s, and I had a friend of mine who was in a romantic relationship, an intimate relationship that was stuck. She called it the never-ending date because they could not take the relationship forward to a deeper commitment and they couldn't end it. So she felt like they were stuck. And I had lunch with her one day. I hadn't seen her for a while. And I said, how are things going? She said, oh, you wouldn't believe what's happening in my life. And I said, well, try me. She said, well, I was sitting with my boyfriend. I was sitting with my boyfriend on the couch. And we were watching television. And all of a sudden, we heard this crash in the bathroom. And we went and looked. And she said, the water pipe, the hot water pipe under the sink had blown open with so much force, it ripped the vanity door off the hinges and blew it into the wall on the other side of the bathroom. And I said, wow, that's amazing. She said, well, I'm not done yet. She said, so we were going into the garage to get in the car to go to the hardware store and fix the sink. And she said the garage floor was covered with hot water from the hot water heater that had exploded in the garage. And as we were backing down the driveway in my Fiero, the radiator hose on my car blew open and blew hot radiator fluid all over the driveway. And I said, wow. I said, what in the world is going on in your life? She said, you wouldn't believe my life. She said, our house, it's like a pressure cooker. And then she stopped right there. And she said, you don't think that has anything to do with what just happened in the bathroom and in the garage, do you? And I said, well, in my world, it has everything to do with what happened. I said, because the pressure, the emotional pressure that you're feeling in this relationship is mirrored. It's reflected in the world around us, sometimes in ways that are obvious, sometimes they aren't. And it depends on whether or not we can resolve those issues or not. But I believe we are tuned so deeply to our world and to one another. So let me share a story of how deeply tuned we are to the beings we share this world with. My mom has a little dog, a little terrier. Her name was Corey Sue, who's no longer in this world right now. But when she shared a very important lesson with my mom. I used to talk to my mom. I'd call her from wherever I was in the world every Sunday just to check in and say hi, how are you doing? And I called her on one Sunday, and she said, well, I'm okay. She said, but I'm concerned about Corey, my dog. And I said, well, what's wrong? She says, well, she's been acting funny, and I took her to the vet. And the vet did some tests, and they ran some x-rays, and her lungs are covered with black spots that are becoming worse and threatening her life. And she said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, I'm concerned about Corey. But I said, in my world, we live in a reflected reality. I said, if Corey is reflecting in her body something in the reality that you share with her, what's happening in your body? I said, have you had a physical recently? She said, yeah, I had one. And I said, did you do a chest x-ray? She said, no, I put that one off. And I said, well, go get a chest x-ray. And I called her the next week. And she waited and waited, and she said, well, I will. She said, first, I want to put a garden in, and I want to get sod in the yard, and I want to get the house painted, all these diversions. And I said, Mom, just go get a chest x-ray. And she did, and sure enough, she had what turned out to be a malignant tumor on her lung. And Mom has read all my books and been to all my programs, and she says, I understand that self-healing is possible. But I'm going to share this with you because I want to share how differently we can think about these things. She said, I understand it's possible. She said, but it's not for me. She said, I need to know in my mind that this tumor is gone. She goes, I'm going to go for surgery and have the tumor removed. And once it's removed, that will free me in the world to change my lifestyle. And she began exercising and taking supplements and changed her diet and everything. But she had to know in her frame of mind that she was free of the tumor. So that's what she did. But here's why I'm sharing the story. After she recovered, we took Corey back to the vet and had her examined again. And when they did the x-rays, all the black spots were gone from her lung. So she was reflecting a condition in my mom's body before my mom even knew it was present. And when we look closely, we find that this happens all the time. Our world is a reflection of our deepest beliefs and of the physical embodiment of those beliefs. And sometimes those around us, people and animals alike, they love us so deeply that they will take on and mirror the conditions that maybe we are not ready to see yet. One of the places where this is so prevalent in everyday life, in the jungles of Peru, where they don't have modern medical equipment and x-ray machines, when someone is really ill and the local healer wants to know what is happening inside the body of the human, what they will do is they will take a guinea pig, and in a very ceremonial way, they will run the body of this guinea pig. They'll simply pass it through the energy of the person that's feeling ill. And in a very humane way, they will take the life of the guinea pig and open the guinea pig's body. And the organs of the guinea pig will mirror what they have just experienced in the energy field of the human that they were just passed through. And they take it on that quickly. It's not judged right, wrong, good, or bad. It simply is a reflection of an energetic reality. So when the native healer sees something happening with the lungs, for example, on the guinea pig on the left, then they know that the left lung of the human needs to be addressed. And then they will go through all of the herbal remedies and the fresh air and the clean water and the exercise and all the things to heal that. But they diagnosed it through a reflection in another living creature. And I'm sharing this story, all of these stories, because we don't often hear about this. We're taught to believe that we're separate from our world, when in fact we are so deeply attuned and deeply connected to the world on both conscious and subconscious levels, that if we look closely at what's happening in our bodies, we will gain the deepest insight into our truest beliefs, not what we claim to be true, and not what our mind or our ego says is true, but what we actually truly believe, even on the subconscious level. Once that's done, as Darren says, Dr. Darren Weissman, that is the portal. Now we can go into that belief and ask the questions. Is it true? Where did we learn this? Where did we hear it from? Who told us this? If it's not true, how can we heal that? What could we replace that belief with that would support a healthier body and a healthier immune system? And I have to tell you that it can happen very, very quickly, much faster than the 72 hours that we talked about growing the new neurons in the past. I've had a personal experience with portals of my body helping me to embrace my past, and Dr. Darren Weissman was the catalyst that helped me to understand and make this connection in my life. There was a time after my father died. He passed during the first week of my book tour with the book, The God Code, in 2004. And I was traveling when he passed. And I canceled the first week of my tour. I went back to do a memorial for a man that I really didn't know because he left my family when I was 10. And I didn't really know how deeply that was affecting me. And it wasn't long after that, I developed a rash on my, just on my upper body, on my chest. It wasn't there all the time, but it was enough to, it was an irritation, and that was the key. And sometimes it would flare up to more. I've tried everything I could think of. I had no idea what was going on because it wasn't a conscious experience. And this is why I turned to Dr. Darren, because he is a master at accessing, through the portal of our own bodies, our subconscious beliefs. And I love the way Darren does this because it's not a talk therapy. He has a very specific protocol. Boom, boom, boom. He goes down, he asks the questions. Depending on that answer, he knows where to go from there to find out what our body is telling us. Well, in this case, Dr. Darren and I had a 45-minute conversation. 20 minutes into the conversation, he was able to determine that my rash literally was an irritation, that my body was expressing a frustration of my inability to heal with my father whatever issues we had before he passed. And now that he's gone, even though I can do it on the inner level, I could never have the physical conversation with him again. And by the end of the conversation, the redness of the rash was completely gone and the swelling was gone. And by the next morning, the rash was gone and it has never returned. And that is a powerful testament to me. It tells me how these subconscious beliefs, how they show up in our lives in times that we least expect, at the most inopportune time sometimes, and what a really clear communication they are presenting us with if we learn the language of our bodies. It's a very different way of thinking about our bodies. A medical model would say, you have a rash, it's an immune response to something, let's put some cortisone on it to make it go away until it heals. And that is another path. So I'm not saying one's right, wrong, good or bad. I'm not judging that. I'm saying our orientation in life helps us determine how deeply we want to understand what life is showing us. And as we embrace the deepest truths of these relationships with our body, the healing becomes almost secondary. The healing, the physical healing of the body is the byproduct of resolution of the feeling or the emotion or the belief. And that's the beauty of understanding the healing of our bodies.
I totally get how our conditioning, and then if something's not resolved, it could manifest in the physical later. But what about the children that come into the world and have child leukemia or,
We don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I can speculate.
Destiny.
Yeah. I think, yes, karma, destiny, fate. I'm a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist. I believe that we owe it to ourselves to be honest, truthful, and factual about who we are in our relationship to the world and where those facts empower us to a greater degree to follow that and to be smart about what that means. Medical science in the West today, in my opinion, has the best diagnostics. We cannot beat it for diagnostics. If we want to find out what's happening in our bodies, we cannot beat the technology that we have today, the ability to peer non-invasively into the body and inform us as to what's happening. Now, what we do with that information, I think, is where the big choice comes from. To me, there's no choice. I think we owe it to ourselves to honor our bodies and know what's happening. Once we understand what it is that our body is telling us, if we're using medical diagnostics, if we're going through someone like Dr. Darren Weissman and going through energetically or spiritually, what do we do with that information? How do we then address that? And this is where all of the wisdom of our ancestors and of traditional healing, quantum healing, the power of emotion to change the chemistry of our bodies, this is where all of these things come together. So what I say to people is simply this. If we can bear in mind, without going into all the specifics in general, we are designed to heal. Your body wants to heal. And the ability to heal is not an evolutionary add-on that occurred after 200,000 years of experience. It's part of our original design. Whoever or whatever it is that's responsible for that, we've had it since we arrived on this earth 200,000 years ago. So knowing that we are designed to heal, knowing that our bodies want to heal, then the question becomes, how do we best stimulate and facilitate that and incorporate that into our lives? Everyone has different belief systems, and we all learn differently. And this is where I think the things that we're talking about right now, from my perspective, they become a tool that we put into the toolbox with all the other tools that we can draw from and use as needed in our highest good to the best of our ability. So rather than becoming a religion or rather becoming its own practice, I think if we can embrace all of these things together, that's where we find our highest good. So people ask me, what about children? Children, young children that come into this world, damaged in the womb in some way or with some deformity or some condition, when they come into the world, how can that be from their subconscious, or is it? And the answer to that is that we simply don't know. I just have to be honest and say that every human that emerges into this world, what has happened before we got here is different for all of us, and we have no way of knowing. And this is where we begin to cross the boundaries of science and spirituality, and the words like karma or destiny or fate. We don't know what those are. What I do know, without any shadow of a doubt, is once that beautiful child arrives in this world, their bodies, their cells, their DNA will respond to the environment and the conditions that we give to them. Our job is to learn to optimize those environments and those conditions. Epigenetics is the new science now that tells us in scientific language that our genetic blueprint, it's not hard-coded. We are not subject to the original blueprint of our DNA for all of our lives. It's like nature gives us a preset genetic code that's enough to get us going when we come into the world. And for some people, that's all they'll ever need. For some people, they choose to expand their lives, and to do that, they make the choices of thought, feeling, emotion, belief, lifestyle that actually activates portions of that code and combines and stimulates portions of that code in ways that they weren't before. Other people that come in, when they have the conditions, the virus or the disease that was with them the moment they emerged into this world, that is what they have to begin with, and their bodies will respond positively to, just the way everyone else's will, to epigenetic factors, to the environment, to love, care, compassion, to a deep understanding, if they are old enough, of their relationship to the world so that they feel safe in the world, to the nutrition, and the way that their caregivers interact with one another in the presence of the child is just as important, because that young person is learning how to deal with life through the mannerisms, the voice patterns, and the emotions that their caregivers, their parents, are exposing them to early in life. It happens for all of us. So we can't know all of the factors that happen before we come into the world. What we can know with certainty is that we are designed to heal, and that our bodies will respond to a healing stimulus if we know how to create that in our lives.
And is love the biggest healing stimulus?
Let me address that. When we harmonize our heart and our brain through the emotions of appreciation, care, gratitude, compassion, one of the most common questions that I get in a live audience, people ask me, they say, what about love? It's a good question. And I asked the researchers at HeartMath the same question, and I was surprised by the answer. And what they said to me was, Gregg, love means different things to different people. And we all have different experiences of love. And for some people, it hasn't been a good experience. So the actual word love often may not be the best word to harmonize the heart and the brain, to create the coherence on the one hand. On the other hand, love is the umbrella under which each of those words fall. So care is a facet of love. Compassion is a facet of love. Appreciation and gratitude, they are expressions of love. So ultimately, we are using the power of love without the specific word of love.
So what is your one takeaway message?
When we now consider everything that we know about our bodies, our relationship to ourselves, one another, and the earth, the new discoveries that are overturning 300 years of science, for me, it all comes down to a very simple principle. That principle is that the better we know ourselves, the better equipped we are to heal our bodies, to heal our emotions, to heal the inner experience that allows us to love to the deepest degree in the outer world. And I think that's really what's important when it comes to the healing that we now understand.